Thanks, Gary. So briefly, I'm Alain Besson, and I'm privileged also to be one of the organizers of this working group for comparative economics. It's my great pleasure to introduce Bruce Hall today. Bruce is Associate Professor in the Department of History at Duke. He's a distinguished specialist of the West African Muslim world. He has published in 2011 A History of Race in Muslim West Africa, 1600-1960, a book that has been distinguished by the Martin A. Klein Prize 2012 at the American Historical Association. He is also the author of a long series of articles on slaves and trade networks in Western Africa, published in the Review of African Political Economy, the Journal of African History, International Journal of African Historical Studies, etc., etc. Indeed, the interaction of trade and slavery is currently the main focus of his work. And this is what has attracted my attention when Bruce was recommended to me as one of the most innovative scholars in this field. Our own interest in the firm made of him the perfect guest for our series. How is it possible to create trust in long-distance trade? What are the characteristics of the specific relationship that exists between a slave and his master that makes slavery the best solution for a firm in a specific context? What does the relationship tell us about the principal-agent relationship in general? These are a few questions among many that will be raised this afternoon. Bruce will talk about slavery and agency inside the 19th century Saharan commercial house in Timbuktu. Please join me in welcoming him.
So thank you, everybody, for coming, and thank you for the invitation, and thank you for the introduction. Let me start by giving a sketch of my argument. So in the Sahara Desert and in the regions that border it, what I'm going to call the circum-Saharan Africa, long-distance trade relied on slaves in the era before the 20th century and before European colonial occupation. We know, of course, that enslaved people were an important trade commodity in the circum-Sahara, and that slaves acted as coerced manual labor in a variety of transportation services, digging wells, in salt mines, working in agriculture and in arboriculture, as people that pastured animals, domestic labor, etc. But what is less well known is that enslaved people also acted as trade agents who were responsible for organizing and carrying out a significant amount of the commercial transactions themselves. So the use of slaves in this way was by no means unique to this region, and it's in fact quite widespread across many African contexts and beyond, especially in the Muslim-majority societies of the Mediterranean and Indian Ocean. And it also existed, I think, as far apart in time as in ancient Rome and in the 18th century Caribbean. But at least to my knowledge, historians have not made a problem of this feature of economic history. And so today I want to explore this theme using material from 19th century circum-Saharan Africa. I'm a historian. I suspect that I am well beyond the boundaries of the firm as they may have been discussed and defined in economics. I know that one of my colleagues at Duke, Timur Kuran, has made the argument that there were fundamental flaws in the institutional framework of Islamic commercial law that prevented the creation of corporations in the pre-modern Muslim world more broadly. And so without wishing to get into a debate about the apparent divergence of global economic performance, what I'm going to try to do is to talk about the internal workings of a particular commercial house or commercial firm. So let me say what I mean by slaves acting as commercial agents. Let me quote from a letter written in 1884 by a merchant named al-Mukhtar bin al-Hajj Ali to give you some idea of what it is that I'm actually thinking about in this relationship. He was writing a letter from the central Saharan oasis of Ghat, which is, I don't have a pointer, but it's one of those sort of in the middle of the Sahara off to the east with a red or pink line under it, in what's today southwestern Libya. And he wrote to two slaves on the southern edge of the desert in Timbuktu, the main town where these letters come from in modern Mali. And this is a distance of more than 1,600 kilometers as the crow flies. This is the letter. You can see in it that he's writing this letter to two slaves who he names, called Sambu and Isa. Thank you. And in the highlighted part in the middle of the letter, he says, the reason for this letter is because Muhammad bin Isa and I have come to Ghat, and we were told that if we want to know what is happening in Timbuktu, we must correspond with the slaves in order to gather news. How can we respond to you unless you send us all the news? And you, O Sambu, this is one of the slaves, this matter is shameful to you. You know everything, and now you are the equivalent of our father. So Sambu, one of the enslaved men to whom this letter was addressed, worked as a commercial agent for his master and his master's extended family. And the letter writers clearly knew Sambu personally. They refer to him as the equivalent of their father, which suggests that Sambu was both older than them and perhaps had exercised even some authority over the letter writers as children. We have these we have an axis of age that is sometimes transversed by this axis of social status. This kind of letter, this kind of demand for information from slaves is quite common in the commercial correspondence written in the 19th century circum-Saharan world. And taken as a whole, it suggests that slaves were important because they were skilled workers, knowledgeable in matters of trade. One of the broader characteristics of slavery in circum-Saharan Africa was that enslaved people were often quite physically mobile, whether following the seasonal movement of pasturing animals or migrating to fill seasonal labor demands. Enslaved people, more broadly, moved around quite a lot. Those who acted as commercial agents usually had apprenticed as children to adult traders, from which they acquired knowledge of the practical functioning of trade and travel that allowed them to take on more responsibility as they grew older. And since these young slaves grew up in the same extended households as their master's children, they typically followed a course of Islamic education that led to some level of literacy in Arabic, and this made them especially valuable commercial agents. But if certain slaves were highly valued for their knowledge and skills in travel and trade, there were also institutional frameworks in the Circum-Sahara that made it very difficult for enslaved people to successfully escape from slavery. There are examples in the literature on this in other parts of Africa, in East Africa, for example. There are cases in the 19th century of slave agents absconding with their master's trade goods and not completing their missions into the interior, usually from coastal points such as Zanzibar or Mombasa. And there are certainly cases in the broad circum-Saharan region of slaves escaping from their masters as well. But I've come to think more and more just how far-reaching the institutions of Islamic legal authority were in the lands in and around the Sahara. It seems completely counterintuitive because the Sahara is sort of is an ultimate wilderness, perhaps. But one encounters case after case in which debts and inheritances were recovered by creditors and heirs on one side of the desert from people living on the other, even many years later. and Saharan trade was in some respects made possible by the extent of the reach and authority of Islamic legal institutions. The anthropologist Judith Sheila has argued that Saharan ecological and climatic conditions led to extreme regional economic specialization and interdependence across the Sahara. And she applies the model developed for the Mediterranean by Peregrine Horden and Nicholas Purcell. Sheila has argued that the Sahara is best understood by its extensive network of connectivity. For local people, the desert is a dangerous wilderness, the Badia in Arabic, that has to be tamed. And it's the profits from commercial enterprises that have been invested or are invested in oasis irrigation and agriculture, and in supporting regional religious practices of Sufism and Islamic legal scholarship that constitute an institutional framework for social and economic interaction across this region. Because property ownership in a particular settlement was not localized, but instead was widely dispersed across the region, the oasis acted as a hub that bound a wider network of people into ties of mutual obligation. Whereas Judith Sheila has focused on sort of broad social and cultural connectivity across the Sahara, the historian Ghislaine Leiden has shown in her work that Islamic jurisprudence was an important institution which permitted legal scholars to regulate disputes and offer services as guarantors and intermediaries. I'm not going to read this particular quote, just except to say that Ghislaine Leiden is arguing here that there's a kind of network of connectivity of these legal authorities across the different settlements in the Sahara, and that it's through these people, essentially, that the institutions of Islamic law are made to apply to commercial activities in this wider region. So what I'm trying to do, what I want to do here is I want to apply these ideas about connectivity and legal institutions to the question of slavery. Just as fellow merchants addressed issues of debt and inheritance to legal authorities and to each other, responsibility for slaves was also understood to be an important part of managing merchants' assets. Fugitive slaves could expect to be tracked down, if not by traders themselves, then by various armed constabulary and military forces active in different parts of the circum-Saharan sub-region. So as a consequence of the importance of the institutions supporting slavery, the paths of enslaved commercial agents out of enslavement ran through the extended family of their masters. Slaves who worked in trade therefore had positive incentives to remain with their masters. And if we think of enslaved commercial agents as knowledgeable and skilled members of the social units that constituted trading firms, if I can use that term, and as constrained in their choices by the institutional and political support for slavery in the circum-Saharan region, we can begin to see why slavery was such an important part of the social fabric of trade. But for trading firms to be effective, slaves had to be treated in ways that bound them to the people in the larger enterprise and that accounted for the social objectives of all of their members. And this very much included those who were enslaved. So the geographic focus of the academic literature on pre-modern long-distance trade is largely determined by the particular configurations of sources which allow us to reconstruct the economic and biographical details of traders' lives and to some extent their motivations. So the Geniza documents from medieval Cairo have fed a rich literature on Jewish traders in the Mediterranean and in the Indian Ocean. Likewise, Francesca Turbeletto's recent work on the letterbooks of early modern Jewish merchants based in Livorno in Italy, or Sebu Aslanian's work on the correspondence left by Armenian traders from New Julfa in Iran. Each of these important works are based on especially rich troves of letters exchanged by merchants. And my work is also based on a rich and hitherto unexploited set of approximately 1,000 letters produced by a single family or a family-based commercial house that was active in the Sahara Desert in the second half of the 19th century. And it's with these letters that I hope to add to our understanding of how trust, agency, commercial strategies, and institutions functioned in pre-modern long-distance commerce more broadly. Some of the older models of pre-modern long-distance trade have recently come under assault. People like Philip Curtin or Shlomo Goitin or Avner Greif, who I believe was here not so long ago, stressed the instrumentality of minority religious or ethnic identities as endogamous mechanisms which could overcome the absence of larger contract-enforcing state institutions. Francesca Turvoletto, Sebu Aslanian, and most recently Jessica Goldberg have all argued that we need to pay much more attention to the state and to its legal institutions. Goldberg in particular has argued that trust does not flow out of shared religious or ethnic identities because of reputational mechanisms alone, and that both Jewish and Muslim courts were much more important to medieval Jewish traders in Cairo than has been acknowledged in this older literature. What I ultimately hope to show is that the institutions which supported slavery were also important to the functioning of long-distance trade in circum-Saharan Africa and elsewhere, because it offered a solution to problems of trust, agency, and commercial strategies. And so this is the larger goal of my project, but here this afternoon I'm going to focus on a somewhat narrower question of the nature of slavery itself in the context of the letters that I'm working with and the way that slavery functioned within this larger commercial organization. I'm going to do this in part because one of the first questions that I often get asked is whether the people that I'm describing are actually slaves in any real sense. If the term slave means anything, has any real significance. And my answer to that is that they are slaves, and I'm going to try to explain why that was important. It is important. It's not simply a characteristic of these commercial houses that could have used people with other social status positions. The fact that these people were enslaved and that the institutions in this part of the world supported slavery in the ways that it did were important to determining how commercial activity was organized. So I now have a pointer. So here's where Ghadamis is, and here's where Timbuktu is. And this is where Gat was, which I was unable to. So this is about a 1,600 kilometer crow trip. The material that I have comes from traders who were originally from up here in and around Ghadamis, who had moved to Timbuktu in the 1850s. The founder of this family-based firm had moved to Timbuktu in the 1850s. This axis between Timbuktu and Ghadamis is an extremely old one and an important one in the economic history of Africa and of the Sahara. We know about Ibn Battuta, the famous Moroccan world traveler, joined a caravan heading to Ghadamis in the 14th century. We have mention of neighborhoods of merchants from Ghadamis in our earliest written sources from Timbuktu and from other places in West Africa. So this is a very long, deep set of relationships, but there's a kind of entrepreneurial opportunism involved in going south from a place like Ghadamis across the desert setting up one's own commercial activities and trying to make a go of it. My letters come from the 19th century. As I say, they come from a firm which was headed by a person named Isa bin Hmida, who was originally from Ghadamisi. He set up a house in Timbuktu in the 1850s, and he died in 1882. After he died, his sons inherited the slaves that had been involved in the commission of the trade that they were involved with, and they continued his business, essentially. So we have at least 2 generations of traders engaged in more or less the same kinds of things that produced the documentary trace that we have. These were people who were involved in trade of Saharan products such as salt, tobacco, textiles, and so these are the things that are coming from the north or coming from the Sahara itself. And they were buying West African products such as gold, foodstuffs, other sorts of textiles, ostrich feathers, ivory, cola nuts, and they were also buying and selling enslaved people. So what we actually have in these letters is evidence of the trans-Saharan slave trade. Many of the letters are, of course, these are letters that are exchanged by people engaged in commerce, so they tend to be about the price of salt, the price of slaves, the availability of certain items in certain places, things that lend a certain, that can produce a certain kind of data, but they also, and what's most interesting to me and what I'm going to focus on today, they also sometimes show relationships between agents and principals, between masters and slaves, between people that are young and old, that have different social status positions. The 2 principal slaves were those that were addressed in that first letter, a man by the name of Anje and another man by the name of Sambu. Each of these people were successful in establishing families in Timbuktu and having households that were attached to their master's household but also autonomous. They had children, and there's a lot of greeting back and forth of these different people and their different social situations. What I have is mostly from around here. The material all comes from Timbuktu. I had hoped when Muammar Gaddafi was overthrown in Libya several years ago that among the benefits of this geopolitical change would be that it would be possible to go to Ghadamisi up here and look at the archival materials that they have. They have published, Libyan scholars have published some of the commercial correspondence from Ghadamisi over the years. But of course, what's happened in Libya since the fall of Gaddafi hasn't made that possible. Perhaps one day one can get at both ends of this commercial network. But for the moment, what I have comes from Timbuktu, and there are lots of letters that go all the way across the desert or into the desert like this, but a lot of the actual commercial activity is taking place right in this sort of Niger Bend region. And a lot of the markets are quite local. And the slave agents tend to be most active in these more local markets over here. There are a lot of other ways of sort of getting at some of the questions that arise in these letters. In particular, jurisprudential materials that I've worked with on other things and which are a larger part of this project. Commerce, questions of how to conduct commerce, and questions of slavery and the way that slavery works in Islamic jurisprudence are topics of a lot of debate and a lot of difference of opinion in the local jurisprudential literature of the Circum-Sahara. But I'm mostly going to focus today on what you can see from inside these letters, which are much more particular to the particular trading house that I'm focused on. The world of Saharan trade came to an end with the colonial conquest at the end of the 19th century, in large part because it opened up opportunities for Atlantic-based trade, and increasingly with the development of colonial transport infrastructure, a lot of the trans-Saharan trade basically was not economical anymore. So this is where this is sort of situated, right at the end of this long era of trans-Saharan trade. Okay, so let me take a step back and describe to you my own introduction to the sources that are the basis of my project. About 10 or 11 years ago, when I was doing my dissertation research in the town of Timbuktu in Mali, I first came across these 19th century Arabic letters that were addressed to slaves. I didn't really spend a lot of time. I was working on something else. It was a curiosity. I certainly made note of it. But I later found, when I turned my attention back to this material, I found that there were actually lots and lots of letters, even letters written by slaves themselves. What I saw when I first encountered this kind of material was something that surprised me at first glance. And I can show you the very first letter. Well, I forgot to show you the different places that this is always my favorite map, my favorite way of demonstrating the aridity of the Sahara and the difficulty of the terrain that people cross. This is the old town of Ghadamisi, which Muammar Gaddafi emptied of its inhabitants at one point because people were able to hide from security forces. But it's a UNESCO World Heritage Site. And here's an old postcard from Timbuktu of the Sankore Mosque, the center of late medieval intellectual activity in Timbuktu and in West Africa. And here's a picture I took once when I was able to join a German documentary crew that was making a film about the manuscripts and about Timbuktu, and this is sort of out of the window. You can see the old town in the center up here. And the neighborhood of the Ghadamisi traders is near this Sankore Mosque, which is up here. And this is my imagination of where the household of the slave agents who I'm interested in, where they would have lived, because today in Timbuktu, this is what I've called a backyard. These kinds of structures are where people who are descended from slaves today, where they tend to live. These are portable. They can be moved at different times. We're talking here about a household in which there'd be a permanent house and in which there might be these less permanent structures which people of low servile status would occupy. And one of the main things that's being traded in these letters is salt. And salt comes from a mine. Salt in Timbuktu comes from a mine in the far north of Mali in the Sahara at a place called Taudeni. And they mine out these bars of salt that weigh about 40 kilograms, and they put them on camels traditionally. They don't do this really anymore except for the tourists, and of course now there's no tourists, but now they use trucks, so this is a little bit of a mock-up. But the price of salt is in these slabs. That's how it's calculated. And this is not far from Timbuktu, so you can see the geography here, the commercial geography connects to a river, a very important river which allows access to areas further south. And I somehow got this again. I'm going the wrong way. Yes, sorry. And this is what it looks like when it gets to the river. Even today, this kind of trade still occurs. And here are some of the main people that are a part of this single commercial house. The master and father and founder of this organization who settled in Timbuktu in the 1850s. I've only mentioned some of his sons here because they show up in some of the letters that we'll talk about. And these are some of his slaves that also show up in the letters. We can understand this as a slice of a larger organization. There are more people that belong to it than just these 7 people. So my surprise at first encountering a letter from this was precisely in the terms that it used to address the slave. And I can just read this very briefly. This letter began as follows. It said, "Praise be to God, and may God bless he who was the last prophet." This is from Ahmed al-Bakai bin Isa bin Hmida to his brother and beloved and only then his slave, Anjay. Greetings to you, and may you have God's mercy and blessings. How are you? How is your family? We hope that you are just as we are, and that you are satisfied with that. What was so interesting to me about this was the familiarity and the affection of the language addressed to a slave. Perhaps I shouldn't have been so surprised by this, because in many of the societies of circum-Saharan Africa, there was a social space for those who were enslaved but fully acculturated to their host society. Many of the societies in this region actually have special terms which they use to describe this kind of acculturated slave. These people are often held in affection as virtual members of their master's family, even as they were made to understand their social inferiority. So as such, there's often an interpenetration of the vocabulary of affection and that of domination in the language used to refer to certain kinds of slave status positions in this part of the world. And this is exactly what we see in this very first letter. The affection and the respect of the master, Ahmed al-Bakai, drew upon a family-like familiarity. As I learned later, Ahmed al-Bakai had in fact grown up in the larger household of his father, the original master of the slave Anjay, before he had died. And after his father's death, Ahmed al-Bakai inherited Anjay with his brothers, who was older than he was. So these men knew each other extremely well. And just one other sort of sense, not the first letter I ever saw, but just sort of a sense of the kinds of relationships that you sometimes see in these letters that were extra commercial, that didn't have to do with the larger functioning of trade. This is from the same person, Ahmed al-Bakai, to the same slave named Anjay, and he says, "You'll see my son Isa coming to you. Put him in the Quranic school of my Sheikh Baba bin Sintawu, and support him as much as you can. Hit him and imprison him and do whatever is possible, and even that which is impossible, until he obeys God and he obeys you. Do not neglect him." So this may seem a bit harsh, but this is from our modern sensibilities, but this is very much the model of Islamic education in this part of the world in the 19th century. Islamic knowledge was to be embodied, and the body was to be disciplined by it. So this is not extraordinary in any sense that there would be corporal punishment prescribed for this boy. This affection and familiarity between master and slave has often led scholars to argue that such relations are somehow not real slavery, that in fact slavery was a kind of incorporative process akin to family. And this has been an especially common refrain amongst scholars of the Muslim world. But this would be an incorrect interpretation, in this case at least, and I dare say in most others, because it ignores the equally important language of domination that attaches to these relationships. And it also ignores the institutions that maintained slavery and made it socially meaningful. It's not an accident that even as Ahmed al-Bakai calls Anjay his brother, he invokes his slave status simultaneously. He does this again and again in his letters, as do other free members of the master's family. They're always referred to as the slave. The term slave is always invoked, no matter how friendly and how intimate the communication is. The fact that Anjay was a slave mattered to everyone, and it governed the paths that were open to him in his life. And this is what is so often missed in the scholarship that seeks to put a benevolent face on slavery in Africa and in the Muslim world. One could go into a lot of detail about the different kinds of terminology and ways in which the slavery is indicated in different kinds of sources. But what I'm going to say, what I'm arguing is I'm not trying to make some sort of transhistorical claim about slavery. The term that's used to refer to the slaves who acted as commercial agents here is the word ghulam, a word which appears in the Judeo-Arabic Geniza documents referring to exactly the same acculturated slaves. And although it's not in the Quran, the term appears in the authoritative hadith collection of al-Bukhari. And it literally means young man or boy, although I think it's a clear marker of slavery as I've indicated here, at least in the circum-Saharan documents that I've been working with. But at the same time, it's a deliberately ambiguous label that communicates the effective quality of relations between slaves and masters. Let me give you an example of how this ambiguity can appear in some of the written texts. This is a very kind of rough document that has to do with an inheritance case, and it's written by a slave. And in this text, he uses a variety of terms to talk about himself and to talk about different slaves within the household. The note suggests that there was a literate usage that distinguished between a responsible and acculturated slave, a ghulam, and a lower stratum of slaves in the case of male laborers who are called arika or rakik, and female, probably domestic slaves who are referred to as abad. The last part seems to indicate that the Ghulam Hamadi considered himself to be part of the deceased master's family household, and perhaps even entitled to a share of his master's property as an heir. And it's not explicit, and it would have no legal standing according to the rules of Maliki jurisprudence, which do not allow slaves or freed slaves to inherit property or to bequeath property that they might own. But that doesn't mean that this wasn't claimed or expected or possibly even delivered. It's not clear. It certainly seems to be an expectation that we see in this document. So this ambiguity must in part reflect the fact that the Islamic textual legal forms defining slavery did not fully contain the lives of the people referred to in these letters, and nor could they have. So what I'm going to do now in the rest of my time is I'm going to indulge in illustrating these arguments using some of the letters exchanged between master and slave. And you can see that I'm going to I've already outlined the nature of this argument. I'm going to break this into these three sub-arguments. So first of all, I've been arguing that slaves were important to the functioning of long-distance trade because their particular knowledge and skills. There are many examples of letters written between enslaved agents and their master communicating prices, market conditions, detailing a shipment being sent to the master, and many of them are quite mundane, as I suggested. I can give you just a quick example here, just to give a flavor of what we see in these sorts of texts. This is a letter from the same slave, Anjay, to his master, Isa. And he says, now then I write to tell you that God willing you will find 30 cotton bands brought to you by Sadi Mahlut. They will be folded in a mat and marked by 2 circles, one inside the other, plus the foot of a bird, just like the mark from twine made from palm frond fiber. He's also bringing with him 1 rod of kola nuts, which contain 1,500 nuts. As for the cotton bands, they are in the middle of the 2 veils, and their price is 11,000 cowries. The cotton bands cost 100,000 salamiyah of salt and 2,000 cowries. As for the price of the 1,500 cotton bands, it was 93,000 cowries. Inside the cotton bands, you will find 8 garments. They are for your beloved al-Madani. The letter writers, this is a kind of thing I suppose you could find in any kind of commercial correspondence, and I don't mean to make too much out of it, except to say that, to provide evidence that these are enslaved agents who are actually carrying out and communicating fully the transactions that they're dealing in. The letters written by slaves sometimes contain commercial intelligence, which the agent had acquired in his travels and dealings. An example comes from a letter written by the other main character in our story, Sambu, to his master Isa. And he says, you asked about the prices of commodities in Sansanding, which is a town further down the Niger River towards modern Ségou and Bamako in the southwest. 1 block of salt sells for 2 mithqals of gold, or 10,000 cowries. Labor is 2,700 cowries. Grain is 400 cowries for a sack. There are no slaves that can be bought profitably here. Cotton strips are cheap, but honey is expensive. Shea butter is expensive. Baobab flour is not available, and tamarind is expensive. Grain is expensive throughout the country, but there are no people who are more dishonest. The people of Sansanding, they gouge prices all the time because they do not believe in God or sheikhs. So don't go to the market in Sansanding.
What does the price of labor mean?
This is the price. So this is the price usually for slaves to carry out labor.
But it says there are no slaves, right?
That can be bought, but there are slaves who can be employed.
What's the unit of time?
Yeah.
It's not indicated in this particular document, but on other documents, something like this will be, a letter will be written in which, so a letter will go with a load, and to the person who's receiving it, it will say, and you owe 2,000 cowries to the porters who carried it, because the unit the unit is in fact a journey, a porterage journey. But precisely what this is here is not clear.
Excuse me, just to clarify, so the possibility here is that a slave could buy another slave for the same.
Absolutely. A slave could buy another slave. There are slaves that are working as hired labor. That's a category that, within the jurisprudential literature, this is it's totally illicit. Slaves are able to hire themselves out. They can be hired out by their masters. If they're hiring themselves out, they can keep the money. They can keep the money that they earn, as long as the relationship with the master is such that that's an agreed situation.
Can a slave buy up or buy down, or do they, if you are a slave of a particular status, you're only able to buy a slave a lower status?
So I'm going to show you something in a minute that will help to answer that question. But in principle, you have two sort of registers here. One, you have a register which is an Islamic legal register, in which any slave is more or less equal as a slave, unless they've given birth, unless they're a woman and they've given birth to their master's child, in which case there are these categories of slaves that are supposed not to be sold. But we also have a kind of vernacular register in West Africa, in which these acculturated slaves, such as the ghulam, such as these people, and there are different words for them in most of the languages of this region, ideologically you're not supposed to be able to sell them. One can sell people that are captured. One can sell people that are first-generation slaves. One is theoretically not allowed to sell slaves that are acculturated. This is at a sort of different level than the Islamic legal jurisprudence. I think that the reality is that this is mixed. It gets mixed up, and it becomes a source for claims made by different people at different times. The ways that anthropologists who studied this, especially in the 1960s and 70s, was to try to come up with a system of understanding the ideology of slavery and how, in the past, by doing kind of oral research in the present. And so we end up with some of these categories in which, you're not supposed to be able to sell these people, and these people have this sort of status. But in these kinds of documents, we see that all kinds of things happen that aren't supposed to happen. So these are sort of ideological statements about what should happen, or they're claims made sometimes by people of slave status. But in any case, we're talking there's a series of registers that are at work here that people can make appeals to. The slaves who acted as commercial agents in larger trade networks were both incorporated into social formations, if not households or lineages, and they were exploited for their commercial labor. But the fact that they were slaves, the fact that these slaves traveled, usually without supervision, suggests that we need to think of them in terms of other kinds of travelers and other arcs of social mobility. The obvious parallel is with the Kabenda agent, or the traveling agent, who in the medieval and early modern Mediterranean and Indian Ocean worlds entered into contractual relations with patrons who provided capital or goods to be traded by the agent in distant markets. And the agent received an agreed percentage of the profits, which he shared with the investor of the capital upon the successful completion of the commercial transaction. I started looking for these kinds of relationships in these letters, in part because some of these questions are pointing to, we have a very kind of muddled practice. People are involved in trying to motivate people for a variety of reasons. There's a labor market for slave labor that has to be paid in wages. What are the incentives that are given to these enslaved commercial agents? I didn't find a lot of evidence for this particular form of agency amongst slaves. In fact, what I found was that when they were working for their masters, they tended to work without any obvious incentives. The letters don't give a lot of evidence of incentives. There's not a payment, if you like, for the successful completion of an economic transaction. But there is a lot of evidence for other commercial partnerships, which we can think of in terms of mufawada, a kind of partnership that is formed by people who put in different. So the Kamenda, the Mudaraba agency relationship implies a patron with a principal who has capital and an agent who doesn't. And the agent is rewarded for his labor in one way or another. The mufawad, and it's a very particular relationship. It has an equivalent in Islamic jurisprudence. It probably comes from the Muslim world, in fact. We don't see this particular thing very often, but what we do see are these other kinds of partnership that are formal. They're a part of Islamic law in another way. And the one that's most obvious is the mufawada, which refers to partnerships in which the partners pool their investments and one partner is commissioned with the authority to conduct trade with the other's capital. And under this kind of arrangement, profits and losses are commensurate with the investment of capital, labor, and equipment made by each partner. So for the followers of the Maliki school of jurisprudence, participation in mufawada partnerships was not restricted to social equals. This is important. The jurisprudence itself makes it possible for slaves and for women, it should be said, to participate in these kinds of contracts, partnerships, with people at a different social status. And the slave upon whom the master has conferred the right to trade actually has a distinct position, a distinct category of slave in Maliki jurisprudence. And this is just a very, very brief passage showing this from a 14th century manual. A distinction is made between those who have been authorized to participate in commerce and those who have not. And in this quotation, the authorized slave is allowed freedom of action in all matters coming under the heading of commerce, such as making a deal. And in this respect, he is like the plenipotentiary agent, the person who's involved in the mudaraba or the commenda interaction, partnership. What's so interesting about the letters to and from the slaves Anje and Sambu is that they were simultaneously involved in all sorts of commercial affairs. I'll give one example, which also happens to be one of the very few letters that was written by a female slave in the equivalent category. This is a woman by the name of Yajida, who identifies herself or was identified by the scribe who wrote this letter as the Suriya of Isa. Suriya is often translated as concubine. It effectively refers to the same position of an acculturated slave within the household as the gulam does for a woman. She's the Suriya of Isa, the same master of Anjay and Sambu, who wrote the letter about commercial ventures. She wrote a letter about the commercial ventures that she was invested in together with Anjay. So I'm not going to read the whole thing, but you can see here she writes, I write to inform you that you will receive from Tafa 2 units, one of hulled rice and the second of tobacco, and 2 strips of cotton equal to 20 lengths, and 5 lube turbans marked with an X. When they reach you, may God's blessings be upon you. Send them to me quickly in less than 3 days and no more than 5 days. I've also sent 1 blanket made from wool to the house of Fatim. Take possession of it and buy it for me in exchange for tobacco. So this is interesting in the sense, in a number of ways perhaps, but aside from the fact that it's a letter written by an enslaved woman, or on behalf of an enslaved woman, the issue that it is concerned with is a side deal that the slave Anjay is to carry out for Yajida. And these kind of commissions are in fact very common in the letters. These commercial agents are working for their masters, but they're also taking advantage of their position to be involved in all kinds of other side deals, mostly from within the same broad commercial house. So we have a commercial house which is socially constituted, but with a series of deals that are going on simultaneously amongst different people from different statuses within it. Unlike the letter from Yajida, so these letters don't really provide any evidence for the kind of compensation, the kind of what it is that Anjay gets out of carrying out this deal, but there are others that do that. In this letter, the top letter, a certain Mustafa bin Muhammad says that, he basically is telling him what he needs to do. I'm sending you 16 units marked with a particular sign, which is the price of the slave girl you bought yourself. Keep her alone in isolation from others. Also, I sent you 26 units of grain. They are mine, and I'm giving you 1. Keep the 25 for me until I come to you, God willing. So the unit of grain given to Anjay does not appear to be a fixed percentage in the sense we might expect in an agency contract, but it is nonetheless a form of payment for Anjay's services, despite the fact that he is addressed as a slave in the letter. And in another letter to Anjay, this time from one of his master's sons, one of the same sons, in fact the same Ahmed al-Bakai that we saw earlier, he says, I received your letter with the things that accompanied it. May God's blessings be upon you. But you'll see coming to you my envoy Muhammad bin Ali bin Muhammad al-Tarmani, who is my confidant. Send the merchandise you mentioned with him and divide it into 3 parts. Keep 1/3 for yourself and send 2/3 to me with him. So here we have a much more obvious commercial partnership relationship that is being discussed within the context of these letters. Let me turn to the second argument that I wanted to make about the reach of institutions around slavery. I'm not going to deal here with the legal literature, although of course there is a lot of Islamic jurisprudence of slavery from this region, as one would expect. But instead I'm going to focus on the letters because I think they tell us something about how vulnerable enslaved people really were in practice. So we can think of the institutions of slavery in terms of expected behavior vis-a-vis fugitive slaves and how this created significant disincentives for slaves to escape. In a letter that was written to Sambu, by Sambu to his master Isa, we find a brief discussion of the fate of a certain gulam, or acculturated slave. The slave girl, so this letter is written by the slave Sambu to his master, and it gets perhaps to the point about certain slaves talking about transactions in other slaves. The slave girl of Brahim, son of what's his name, went to Segu, even though I told her, and she knows very well that she will have no better luck there. As for the slaves of the whites, and by this it means the Arabs, not the Europeans, who are in Segu, some of them died, others escaped, and some are still there in Segu. Masaud has passed away, may God have mercy upon him, and the only thing that he has left was a young slave. 3 people here asked about his debts, and I said that we would seize the slave. They said that no one had seized him yet, that he is currently at the mercy of God and his prophet. So it's not clear that these slaves who escaped were acting as commercial agents, but it does point to the fact that escape did happen and that it was a threat to the trading firms that relied upon slaves. But slaves could also be seized by other merchants as a way of recovering debt or for transferring heritable property of a dead master. And while it's certainly possible that a slave could survive by running away in the middle Niger Valley from where this letter was written, or in the broader Circum-Sahara, they ran a very high risk of being recaptured by various armed slaving forces. This is the period of time in the Circum-Sahara and certainly in West Africa when slavery is an extremely important institution across the board. This is, we have to remember, not long after the abolition of the Atlantic slave trade, which, a wide literature in African history has told us left in place a whole set of institutions for essentially capturing slaves or producing slaves, and the market in the Atlantic was closed off for them.
Yeah. Do you read this as a way of Sambu saying to his master that he's loyal? Or do you just read this as an incidental event that has no ideological purpose?
I do read it as an indication of the loyalty of Sambu to his master. I think that most of these letters can be read in that way. I don't know that it indicates that he was in fact loyal to his master, but he's certainly making the argument to his master that he is.
Yeah, the opportunity. He was near these other people who were runaways, and he was not. Yeah.
Oh, I see what you mean. Whether he could have himself run away, yeah. That I'm not sure. I don't see in the lives, and it's very episodic, and it comes through a veil or a very opaque window that is this letter, which is the language that's used to talk to a master. So when you're doing that, you're not getting at an authentic voice or subjectivity, of course. But I see these 2 men consistently making the case that they are pious, that they are Muslims, that they would never do dishonest things, that their creditors need not worry. I mean, they're constantly making this point, and they're making it within a language of Islam and Islamic piety, which makes me think that what they're really hoping for is a kind of social promotion within the units of their master. That their ultimate goal here is not escape, but manumission, and by manumission they achieve a certain kind of social promotion, a greater autonomy, an ability to act independent. There's no ideological space for independence in manumission, but there is a greater amount of autonomy that can be achieved through manumission, and that's the goal that they seem to consistently have. And we'll see a case of that in a minute.
If you're a manumitted person, a former slave, are you then able to continue to engage in commercial trade, or are you the cost of your freedom is exclusion from all of these commercial networks and the inability to use your skills?
So this is the sort of gets at the different incentives of the different actors. There seems to be a disincentive for masters to free their slaves because they're an integral part of their commercial activities. The slaves can continue to participate in the kinds of activities that some of these sort of side deals and whatever else. They can continue to use the cultural capital that they've that they've generated through their honest behavior, if indeed that's what they have done. And to get manumitted, they need to be recognized as honest and pious. And right, so it's a sort of reward for good behavior over a long period of time. But ultimately, they're in a bind, because although they can achieve a kind of autonomy, they can't ultimately bequeath to their heirs, to their children, to their wives. They're not in a position essentially to establish themselves. Ideologically, they're not in a position to establish themselves as fully independent. Right? The thing that comes through in these letters is that that's not what they're looking to do. Now, that might just be what they say in the letters. That might not be what they actually think or thought as people. But they remain in this relationship, and they would have had plenty of opportunities to leave it within the confines that I'm talking about here. Let me try to get towards the end of this before I take up way too much time. So the point I would like to make is that even these slaves that had great skill, even these slaves who were literate and who had acted honestly enough at least to continue to be employed in these kinds of trading missions over many years, even these people for whom the sale by the master to somebody else was theoretically prescribed, as I mentioned earlier, we still see in actual practice cases where this did happen. And this is one, and I'm going to read this at some length, just to give a sense of what is going on here. This is a letter written by a man named Abdurrahman Yamina, was sent along with Isa's slave agent Sambu. So this is brought by Sambu, and is part of some sort of group of people that are carrying merchandise, some small caravan, or some small traveling commercial party. And in the letter, we get a glimpse of how the Saharan slave trade itself occupied, on a very sort of micro scale, but that's why I want to read it. The reason for our letter to you is to tell you that you will see, with the slaves brought to you by your slave, Sambu, in loyalty to God and under his protection, 30 units of food, 8 of which are unadulterated rice, while the rest are white corn. In this, there are 2 or 3 units of personal property, which God only knows the value of. You will also receive 1 container of kola nuts, which holds 2,200 nuts that belong to Nana Zawja. After that, know that 1 unit of this number is marked with a white rag tied to the container of the kola nuts, which belongs to Zawja. From God and then from you, we want you to use the kola nuts to buy sheep. Zawja tells you that when you sell her merchandise, you should ask for a silver Maria Theresa dollar and lace, also selling 5,000 of something, which you should count in the money of Zawja. Exchange what remains for good salt. After this, you will see the aforementioned merchandise, a little bit of honey that belongs to me, Abdurrahman, to put in together with the food. Now the interesting part. After that, we want from God and his prophet, and only then from you, that you sell one of the slaves named Kunma when he arrives. Sell him to the people of Tuat. Tuat is an oasis complex in what's today southern Algeria, so that he will go to their country. You must sell him because otherwise he will reveal the secrets of his master's family. This is the reason that I ask you to sell him. May God reward you. In addition, you will receive 1 female slave. Sell this slave together with the aforementioned slave for a single price. When the notables from Tuat come to you, exchange them for tobacco, or if the notables from Tuat do not come, wait for the Azalai, that's the salt caravan into the Sahara that I showed a picture of. Wait for it to arrive and exchange them and the food and honey for salt. May God preserve your life. Know that we want from God, and only then from you, that we all join together in the matter of your merchandise and the matter of the food. I will bring it with me and send somebody with it very quickly, without delay. God willing, I ask you to look for 10 measures of wheat, which we will put in a container. Praise be to God, who has reunited you and your slave, who is the letter carrier. Goodbye. So, even though the Ghulam slaves like Sambu and Anje appear to have lived lives that involve significant autonomy, including the ability to form families, they were also always vulnerable to the whims of their master, who could, as the above case shows, extinguish the social world which these slaves had constructed. This was always a possibility, even for these people. The third argument that I want to make and the last argument, is focused on the language of affinity that was employed in so many letters and addressed to slaves, which I think gets to some of the questions that have been asked. And it's the quality of correspondence that helps us to see the extent to which trading practices were embedded in the larger social relations and cultural frameworks of the Circum-Sahara. So I've already argued that the language of affinity is not surprising in the historical context of African or Middle Eastern slavery, although much academic debate has occurred over how to characterize slavery in Africa and the broader Muslim world. It's very often been represented by slaveholders or their descendants as an integrative institution akin to family. And while this is certainly ideological, it's not necessarily incorrect. And that's what I hope to show here. It seems clear, at least in the case of these slaves and their commercial firm, that the language of affinity was also instrumental, offered as a kind of promise to slaves about what their place was and would be in the larger family. Eventual manumission did not mean independence or freedom from the family of the master. Instead, it meant fuller integration as a junior client. And I can develop this further with the help of one last letter written by Ange to his original master, Issa, in the 1860s. And it's this letter that I quoted part of before to show you some of Ange's commercial skills. He's writing from a town called Yuvaru, which we don't see on the map, but which is down over here. It's about 200 kilometers southwest of Timbuktu. He's writing to Issa, who is in Timbuktu. And we can see something of the relationship that is invoked and negotiated between slave and master in some of these letters. So I'm going to read this. I also received your first letter, and the second one, which arrived on the same day that I wrote you my letter. I read both of them, and I understand their content. You said in the two letters that you had ordered me to return to you and not to remain here. I have not deviated from this for even one day. I do not disobey your commands and your orders because I do not wish to disobey them even for a single moment. Everything that you reproached me for is because of a delay caused by circumstances, not my personal choice. There is no quick business in the town of Uoru. Salt is not sold quickly and gold is not found easily. But you are absent and I am present. It is those who are here on the ground who can see and know what those who are not here cannot see and cannot possibly know. This is the difference between you and me. I have no personal business in remaining here other than your service and business. Since we have come to the town of Uoru, not one of us has slept securely in our houses. Instead, we have spent our nights beside the river guarding our goods from our enemies. None of the foreigners who are in the town of Uoru sleep in their houses because they must spend their nights beside the river. We have spent 3 consecutive nights outside in this way. In these conditions, the heart does not rest peacefully. It is better to do that than to do something else. The final part of this letter says, I asked Saadi to delay his trip here for a few days so I could put together a little bit of gold and send it to you with him. But he said that he could not stay here any longer. God willing, you will see all the gold that I acquired in these last days. As for the fact that he said that I had sold on credit, I did this only for 1/2 load of tobacco, which I sold for 100,000 cowries on credit. This was a mistake on my part, but it was decreed by God Almighty, and I did not do it by my own will. God willing, I will come to you without further delay. Do not listen to everything that people say to you until you see me, God willing. To you, I am like the mouse that is in the house of the people. He does not abandon these people of the house. You and I are like that. So rest your heart in peace about me. From me, you will see only things that please you, God willing. I swore an oath to God Almighty to never betray you. Even if people tell you that I'm stealing your money, I will walk to you on my 2 feet, God willing. I will walk to you myself, and you will do with me what you want. I prefer this to betraying you. I read this because I think it gets at the voice of these people and the nature of the negotiations that are involved between master and slave. But I want to just say that by invoking divine will repeatedly and suggesting that his relationship with his master was religiously sanctioned, Ange made claims on his master as a client. And although he was a slave, Ange represented himself as a junior client of Issa's household and commercial network. and Andrzej's ability to lay claim to this position was bound up with his master's perception of his loyalty and his Muslim piety. So as such, Andrzej's path out of slavery required that he acknowledge the legitimacy of his enslavement in the first place. It was from this that his reputation as an honest agent was maintained, and that he was able to marry and live with some degree of autonomy despite his slave status. And it was ultimately how he achieved his manumission later in his life. I want to show one last thing, and it's in lieu of a conclusion. It's another document that I found that surprised me and excited me when I first found it. It's a document that was made at Andrzej's death by one of the Qadis of Timbuktu, listing an inventory of the books that Andrzej the slave possessed in his house. So a big surprise was that a slave would possess these kind of books. I said at the beginning of this talk that for the trading firms to be effective, slaves had to be treated in ways that bound them to the people in the larger enterprise, and that accounted for the social objectives of all of the members within these enterprises, including those who were enslaved. And as I have just said, that usually meant eventual manumission and promotion within the existing extended family of the master, at least in the period before the beginning of colonial rule, after which opportunities for fuller independence became much greater for slaves and for former slaves. The evidence found in the al-Ghadamisi letters in Timbuktu suggests that the process of manumission could be very complicated, even for slaves who had developed stellar reputations over years of acting as commercial agents. And I don't have any direct testimony from Andrzej or from Sambu about their expectations of being freed, although I do have a number of letters which mention a delay in their manumission or disagreement among Isa's sons over whether to free them or not. But in one obvious sense, the commercial skills of Andrzej and Sambu created the disincentive for their masters to manumit them at all. But we do know that Andrzej was eventually freed very late in his life. If there's anybody that still wonders whether this was really slavery and how, in a sense, it was really slavery, I should make one final point. So I've annotated this list of books. It's not spelled out in the kind of detail that's over here, but I've just identified what these are. These were Andrzej's most prized possessions. His books, which we have just seen, were not bequeathed to his wife or to his children. The reason that this document was made was precisely because these possessions were to be claimed by his former master by this point. Right? So this was an exciting thing to find, because wow, this is a slave who has all these Islamic books. But understanding why this document exists gets us back to the whole point of why slavery mattered so much to everybody involved here. The incentives for these slaves, economic and social incentives, could be used by these larger firms and by their masters, because ultimately they could then claim whatever product of the accumulation of these slaves at the end of their life. So even at the end of his life, even after having achieved manumission, the institution of slavery continued to define the possibilities and the parameters of Andrzej's social being. So I'm going to stop there. Thank you for your patience.
I'm sure we'll have many questions. David?
I'd like to start with a very broad question related to something you said at the beginning about the contrast between your approach or your thesis and what you saw as the earlier approach of scholars who had studied the al-Ghadamisi and had a model of the development of trust and lowering of transaction costs through the familial and kinship network of co-religionists, right? As compared to what I heard you say as the kind of objective structure of Islamic legal institutions, replacing in this context or performing the same function in this context. Do I understand you correctly so far that, broadly speaking, you're emphasizing more the larger, shall we say, impersonal framework of Islamic jurisprudence as that which is allowing efficient cooperation in the same way that within the Jewish trading families they would do that through familial ties. And if that's what you're saying, I'm a little surprised, because what I took away from all of this very vivid narration is that it wasn't the external structure of Islamic jurisprudence, but the fact that the slaves had become part of the family understood in Islamic terms. You see what I'm saying? That in fact the Islamic jurisprudential framework is creating among the slaves the kind of the bonds of attachment that would otherwise have occurred through these Jewish families. You see what I'm saying? That it seems less of a kind of a matter of objective political and legal institutions as, you know, deeply shared commitment to the same ideological system, which you could say is then quite parallel to the Jewish trading families.
So my sort of starting point, I mean, it's a central thing that you're pointing to, I think, and not just in this story, but in the Geniza story and a lot of others. My starting point was to try to understand this material very much within this literature of Avner Greif, or, you know, within this sort of endogamous reputational institutions. And I mean, I'm not arguing that that's not important, that it doesn't play out in the ways that these people talk to each other. But I've come to think more and more, first of all, I've come to think, after reading and thinking about the way that Jessica Goldberg has tried to take on the argument that Avner Greif has made, using the same sources, and has shown, at least to my satisfaction, that I'm not a scholar of the Geniza, so I mean, perhaps this is a wrong reading, but that these wider institutions were much more important, and that they were simultaneous. So people were making reference to reputation, but this wasn't the basis of the enterprise that they were involved in.
That could only work because there was this larger framework.
And according to Jessica Goldberg, they wrote these letters, they wrote contracts. These are Jewish merchants. They wrote these not just for Jewish courts, but that would also be valid in Muslim courts in Fatimid Egypt. I find that, I found that convincing, and that made me try to think about the ways in which, this is a kind of case where you would think there are very few institutions. The kinds of political kind of state that you find in medieval Egypt is not present in this part of the Sahara. But I have come to think that more and more there's this external world in which jurisprudence and which the social connectivity of the people themselves make the possibility of these slaves leaving, finding another master, basically having an out, a kind of impossibility. I mean, it's not impossible for them to leave and to find some sort of place where they could hide. But this is a place in which people are, it's very difficult to survive in the absence of these wider connections, and in the absence of it's very difficult to carry out trade in this region without doing things in terms of the Islamic jurisprudential structures that are in place. So, my argument here is perhaps that the language that's used in these letters between the slaves and their masters, or between the masters and the slaves, is very much about piety and culture and this endogamous relationship that they all have. But that's a constrained choice because of the difficulty that they would have in moving outside of that.
And just to follow up, but what you're saying then is it's not that they're enforcing the relationship and that the slave is to be trusted because he has so deeply internalized or is trusted on a personal level as someone who just is committed fully to the same structure, but that there are indeed external institutions you can call before a court pretty easily and and enforce in that external way. That's
Yeah,
lurking behind all of this language of piety of the slave is that threat.
The reason that I wanted to show that last letter, those two last letters, really those two last letters are kind of the two most important things I wanted to show. All the other stuff was sort of, but was precisely because these two possibilities are at work. And I think when I first was thinking about this, I was paying a lot of attention to the literal rhetoric of the slaves, their claims to piety. And I mean, ultimately, it's impossible to know for sure what these people were really thinking. But I've come to think of these letters as much more as a set of claims and contestations than representations of actual sort of religious piety and identity. So, I mean, I think that there's a balance between those two things, and if one can make that case in a place like the Sahara, and people accept it, I don't know that they do, but if I can make that case, I think that it strengthens the point that people like Jessica Goldberg are making about Geniza and other sorts of institutions that are external to these networks.
Well, there are other categories of non-free besides slave and, I assume, free commoners. There's immediate categories.
I mean, again, it depends on the register. So in the Islamic legal register, no. I mean, there are free people, there are freed people, and there are slaves. But in the vernacular cultures of this region, yes, there were people that occupied kind of casted positions, endogamous castes, blacksmiths, sort of people that were specialists in certain kinds of trades. Singers, bards, people like this as well. And of course you had something else, which is you had these sorts of people that within this circum-Saharan world, and especially on the southern edge of the Sahara, you have a lot of people that in a vernacular way are understood to have been conquered, or autochthonous people who were conquered by subsequent invaders, and they occupy a kind of racialized position as inferior in one way or another. And very often it's from those people that the slaves were themselves drawn as children. So it's a little bit, sort of depends on which register we're looking for here. Ralph?
I was thinking about the comparison with slavery in coastal Africa and forest Africa, which is non-Islamic societies. And what I've seen the big difference here is there's much more mobility of slaves there. And also it's interesting, we know much more about them, and this is really pioneering work. We know much less about the internal life of slaves in the Sahara, or haven't recently. I was thinking, here there seem to be real barriers. You have to prove your piety, and you are attributing this to the legal structure, which is also consistent with Junen's argument about the law coming in the 18th and especially 19th century, more paper, more law, much more of a formal impersonal structure on top of the personalized structure. But the other thing, which you just brought up yourself, that differentiates slave-master relations in the Sahara from coastal regions is race. Of course, there are fine differences. People in sub-Saharan Africa always claim they can tell your ethnicity from looking at you, but one doubts whether that's even true. And clearly, when people became enslaved, they became acculturated, and we know they rose to very high positions in these former autonomous units, or became the main patrons of large families, and so on and so forth. So, would you say that it's law or race or some kind of combination of them that makes this barrier much more difficult, that restricts the mobility? That's what I seem to see with you, that there's mobility, but it's really restricted and requires a lot of effort to actually achieve.
So, so as mentioned in the introduction, I wrote a book about race and how race was sort of configured locally and theoretically in this region. But I think it does function in some ways as a further restriction. People are very mobile. Slaves are very mobile in the Sahara, but they're not. Nobody takes them for people that are not slaves, right? Their status is defined very much by a kind of racialized understanding of who they are. And you see this even in this network. You see there are a few examples of letters that were sort of passport letters. The master wrote a letter on behalf of Anjay to somebody else saying, "Look, here's my slave. He's going to come to you. Please treat him well. this is what he's doing. He's not just a slave. So presumably, one of the things that that indicates is that he's vulnerable, not just by people that know him, people that know his story, but he's also vulnerable traveling in these circuits for racial reasons or for racialized reasons. And I think that this layer is something that you can actually see through to the 20th century. The ways in which travelers and commercial networks in the Sahara in the 20th century are the way that people from sub-Saharan Africa are racialized and treated by, say, the Algerian state, makes their kind of economic trade very difficult, makes it more difficult for them to act. And it's sort of, the Judith Sheila book, I don't know if you're familiar with it, but is a very, very interesting book because it shows how the advent of colonialism and then the advent of post-colonial state structures and much stronger state structures in North Africa than in West Africa has created a situation in which people from North Africa have been able to basically dominate the Saharan trade. People from sub-Saharan Africa have a very, very difficult time precisely because they're treated by the Algerian, the Libyan, the Moroccan state as, second-class people without papers, etc. So yeah, I think this is another layer of this story which makes it difficult for enslaved people in the Circum-Sahara to be more autonomous.
One more question. The reason for the mobility of slaves in the areas I was looking at is this ability to select the most able young person among the slaves, who almost always is smarter than anybody that actually descended from the master.
Mm-hmm.
So you end up that these trading networks fall into the hands of the most able people, the slaves. Sometimes marry the boss's daughter or something like that, but nevertheless, they rise because of this doesn't seem to be the case, and none of them really become big. You're suggesting, particularly in the post-colonial, they don't really become big men.
Well, they do become big men in the post-colonial period. So there are examples from like Stephen Bear and northern Nigeria and Niger of. So the other place where these Ghadamist traders were really important was in what's today northern Nigeria, and there are examples there of people that were slaves. Very much like these agents, who either themselves or their children essentially became very important traders in the colonial period. But essentially after this was done, right? After they were able to mobilize, at least in northern Nigeria, a certain kind of economic and perhaps cultural capital to become a new kind of trader under colonial rule. One sees the same thing in
trading to the coast rather than across the Sahara.
Right. Yeah. I mean, the trade changes, and different people are able to enter it because of the colonial situation. But that's something we really see in the colonial period in the 20th century, not in this 19th century period. But I mean, the sources here are very limited, so one doesn't know. One can't speak necessarily that this didn't happen in certain sense. But if it did happen in this world, one has to invent a new genealogy, right? So one doesn't acknowledge one's slave status. There are people that have become prominent in, say, 20th century northern Mali who've gone to enormous lengths to devise genealogies, I mean, despite being very black, and everybody thinking that they're descended from slaves, who have gone to enormous lengths to arrive at genealogies which connect them to Fulbe or somebody else or some other sort of lost whatever, right? So as the descendants of these slaves, no. Certainly not in northern Mali, not in the Sahara itself. Yeah.
So I found this fascinating, and I know nothing about North African or West African slavery for that matter, but you kept on talking through the course of your talk about the fact that it had surprised you to discover that these relations operated in the way that they did. Like, I have no difficulty believing that this is a form of slavery, but I suppose I don't understand why it would be surprising that slavery would operate in this sort of much less, let's say, just immediately violent register. Nor does it surprise me that slavery would allow a sort of status elevation, unless one is taking as the starting point of slavery to North American slavery, right? If one wants to think of historic forms of slavery elsewhere, it doesn't seem all that surprising that people would be able to operate with greater degrees of autonomy, or that they would be able to fulfill what are quasi-managerial or intermediary functions, while still being bound into relations of domination that may take, as in this case, or as was the case in sort of indigenous North America, a more kinship-based, like a sort of enfolding into a kinship network, but nevertheless at some sort of subordinate category. And so I don't know whether or not there's a reason why someone who studies North African slavery would find this surprising that doesn't sort of tie back to a North American slavery. And so I just wanted you to say that.
Well, I shouldn't have found it surprising, I think, is what I would say. I did find it surprising, I think, because perhaps in part I did have, I think there's a lot of literature on slavery in Africa, and there's a lot of debate within Africa about the nature of that slavery. And of course, part of the reason there's a lot of debate is because in some places it's different from in other places, right? There's a great diversity in the African continent. I think probably, though, you're right, there was a kind of North American or Atlantic model in some place in the back of my head, which is wrong. I shouldn't have had that. That was a wrong place to start. But I think the thing that was most surprising for me was actually that here were slaves reading and writing letters. And from an African history of slavery point of view, that's something we don't have very much of. The library of this slave is something I don't know of any other example of something like that. So, just the sort of empirical fact of these kinds of relationships was something that was exciting, and I was surprised by the extent to which these were real relationships, really effective relationships. And I think theoretically you're right, shouldn't be surprised by that. But I think it's difficult to entirely escape our North American context and the ways in which we think about slavery in a vernacular idiom. So I would say that's the starting point there. Yeah.
Right. Can I ask one follow-up about it? So you took this letter as sort of as a key piece, or the context of this letter as a key piece of evidence for why this constitutes slavery, whereas I would have read the earlier letters you reduced as a much stronger source. I don't know that the fact that property that someone possesses might be possessed without being owned, right, would necessarily mean that was an effect of slavery, as opposed to, I don't know what the legal basis in your story is for the fact that these belongings revert to the former master rather than to the.
So there is a legal story and a legal debate in West Africa around the same time that this document was produced about precisely this question of the ability of freed slaves, manumitted slaves, to continue to possess and to bequeath their own property. And it becomes a source of quite a lot of very heated debate. And in the 20th century, so this is right at the cusp of, right at the beginning of the colonial period, the colonial state sides with slave masters, at least in what's today Mali and most of the Sahel, and says, no, the property goes back to the master. And even multi-generations of people that are sort of remain in some sort of abstract slavery, even if they don't have direct relationships with their masters. So it's only in northern Mali, it's only at independence in 1960 when the state finally changes that, and it becomes possible for people of slave descent to continue to bequeath their own property. So yeah, it comes out of a sort of a wider debate. When I first saw this, though, I was most excited by the presence of these texts, rather the fact of the literacy and sophistication intellectually of the person who owned these things in his house is the thing that was most interesting and surprising to me. The fact that he wasn't able to keep this material, I didn't understand. I just thought this was an example of, how sophisticated and how autonomous and a particular rank of slavery, which we don't really think that much about in African history. But it's only subsequently that I've come to understand the reason for the production of this document, which wasn't simply to show that the slave had these things. It was essentially to make a claim upon them. Yes?
I guess this links a little bit this question with the initial question about the critique of Greif and what is slavery in this context, in a way, what role does it play in the analysis? And the two things that are striking. One is that most of these books are legal texts. And the other thing is that there was so much discretion that was afforded to the slaves as trading agents. The instructions were, well, sell it for this kind of stuff, but if you can't do that, then get some salt. And you leave to the slave the sort of decision-making authority and the kind of maximization, entrepreneurialism locally, and the slave presumably would then have to justify to the slave owner why the mix that he or she.
And he was in the act of doing that in one of his letters. Right?
And
I'm not on the ground.
Right, exactly.
It's not only that he was actually doing that in the letter, but that was part of the ideological space.
And the guy says, well, I shouldn't have done this. I thought it would work, and it didn't work. So the thing that goes to the Greif thing has to be, and which is underplayed in the way in which you portrayed this, is how does sanctioning work in this kind of context? When there's discretion.
You can rip them off every day of the week. And how does the master trust?
Or it's not necessarily trust. If there's law, you look at all these law books, there must be some formal procedure about sanctioning that the slave, Anjay, in the final thing was invoking. Look, we have a dispute. And it's not trust. There's actual dispute. But you don't really. It would be really interesting to know, or to have examples of how these kinds of disputes were then resolved, and how sanctions were put out. And that would say a lot, both about the nature of the economic process, but also about, I think, the character of domination in that Saharan slave.
Just jumping on this question, the legal issues, was it between master and the agent, or was it between agents, because the conflicts with clients with other partners is another story?
So it would be extremely wonderful to have that kind of conflict resolution. Unfortunately, we have two kinds of sources, essentially. Three, if we count the colonial sources, which come in at the very end of the story. But if we don't count those, so there is some kind of effort there is some evidence of conflict resolution in the colonial documents. But it's not specific to this group of people, and it's mostly not focused on these kinds of issues, which got adjudicated by local legal authorities, qadis in Islamic legal settings. Most of those, so I don't have the kinds of evidence from that I would love to have. What I do have are a lot of more abstract jurisprudential questions and answers from the same time period, some of which deal with slavery, many of them deal with slavery, many of them deal, including this issue about the question of bequeathing by freed slaves. I mean, that comes out of that kind of, in a very abstract, right? So all the historical details are removed, but this is written in a particular place by a particular person. Somebody wrote him a letter saying, what do we do in this situation? Somebody's claiming this, I don't think that's right. He writes a long response, which is very theoretical and scholastic, but putting these things together, there's a collection that I've worked extensively with before, which I also use in this project as well, is 1,000 manuscript pages of opinions. There's over 1,000 legal opinions produced by a scholar, more or less at the same time, more or less in the same region. And tons of them deal with slavery, tons of them deal with certain kinds of commercial disputes, bad sales, issues about legal fictions to basically get around injunctions against interest and all sorts of other things. But we don't really have the details of how the disputes were resolved within this network, except through the letters themselves and the kinds of relationships which you build. So in a sense, maybe one comes away with this skeptical of my argument about the importance of institutions because of the absence of sort of full evidence for it. But I think one of the things that the letters are pointing us towards is the disputes are not, it is true that he's making a claim for his own honesty and his own piety. There's absolutely no question about that. And that's valuable to him. Insofar as people recognize him as an honest agent, that's valuable. So the reputation does matter. But that he doesn't operate in the absence of those other institutions which make it possible for somebody to haul him in front of somebody for behaving badly, for selling goods that are corrupted, for doing all kinds of things that he might do that would invoke these legal authorities. So, I mean, I think that I'd like to be able to answer that with more authority than I have, but I do think these things are in some
But
sort of
didn't
balance.
you show a direct piece of evidence of what the low-cost dispute resolution mechanism for the master is if he loses trust in a slave that he's known all his life? He sells them.
Well,
Right? I mean, like, in other words, the fact, like, the sanction in a dispute between master and slave, simple, cheap, and the one that's constraining the slave in some sense is he could be sold, right? Despite a lifetime of close personal relationship, if his master loses.
so I'm not sure that it's quite so inexpensive to do that. I think that selling a slave who has this skill set, I mean, we don't know the full skill set of this particular slave, but he's given the same status. But these guys these are not can't just replace these guys easily. Right? These people serve a very, very useful function. They're somewhat, I mean, the reason they're using slavery is in some ways because there's not a sort of market in sort of wage labor for this kind of product. There aren't enough people that can do this kind of thing. It's right that the fact that they're slaves limits their opportunities to do something else. It is true that there is an ultimate sanction, which I showed one piece of evidence for. But I don't think I don't think that means that the institutions are of no importance in the way this works.
You mentioned this vernacular register of law. Is there any sort of imperial past that contributed to this vernacular level?
Imperial in
The Timbuktu area.
So there's a history of very large and powerful states, pre-colonial states, that definitely contributed to this, and which is invoked, which is very much a part of the sort of vernacular, custom, and the language of rights and responsibilities, and about slavery, because slavery was an important institution in those states.
So the last question, my privilege. I would like just to ask you a question. I work on the sea, not a sea of sand, with the deep salt water, Mediterranean, and of course there were also trade networks, trade firms, etc. And interestingly, from the sources we have in the 4th century, we know that also slaves could be used as agents for exactly the same situation of those you have described for the state. But this obviously was not the system which was preferred. This was only a minority of cases. Most traders were free agents. And my question, a very precise question. So there was the choice, and in the Mediterranean world, in the classical Greek world, it was mostly free agents. For the Roman world, it would be, of course, animated people, but not slaves. Animated people who would perform this. And my question, very precise question, is why didn't they use the system of free people? So what was the advantage, was the benefit of using slaves, and why not using, for instance, the sons of the family as trading agents?
So that's a question that I've thought a lot about, and I don't know that I can come up with an answer that's going to be satisfactory. I can, however, point you to some further evidence for why this is not. This is a choice made by this particular firm. It wasn't the choice made by every trading group. So it wasn't the only way that trade was carried out, certainly. Just go back to the Geniza documents, which seem very similar in some sort of ways to these, at least in the sorts of topics that they're talking about and what they're doing. I mean, I think that the percentage of slaves that are acting as agents, or their slaves are acting as agents, especially in the Indian Ocean side of that trade, but they are 7 or 10% or something. I forget the exact number, but it's something in that neighborhood. I think that it has to do with the importance of slavery more broadly in the particular geographical context and the temporal context in which this is happening. So I wouldn't want to argue that this is the way Saharan trade was carried out over 1,000 years. That would be empirically incorrect, although I think slaves were involved in it in different times. But I think that the fact that slavery was such an important institution, that the institutions which produced and policed slavery by the 19th century in West Africa were so developed. I mean, 7 million Africans were transported across the sea, or some such number in the 18th century. I mean, this was a massive, this had a massive impact on West Africa. And I think it's the presence of all of those slaves who were put to work in particular ways, perhaps creative ways. Ghislaine Leiden, who Ralph Austin mentioned earlier, is a colleague, a friend who has worked on trade networks that moved from sort of southern Morocco down through Mauritania, some to Timbuktu, some further to the west. And she's basically been interested in the free agents, if you like, people that are incentivized through different kinds of partnership arrangements, for whom the institutions of Islamic law function as a kind of brake on cheating or dishonesty to some extent. But I think, this is not going to satisfy perhaps as an answer, but I think that this is in a way a kind of creative response to two things. One is the difficulty of operating, the difficulty of trust in across this wider Saharan region, and secondly, the presence of so many slaves inexpensively that could be drawn into these social units as children. And the evidence from the children, the free children of the master here, Isa, suggests that they were much more unruly and much more difficult to manage, and didn't do things that their father wanted them to do, and didn't get along with each other. And there are plenty of letters in which they're basically using the slaves as the sort of mediators in disputes. Well, my brother said this, don't believe him until you come. And he says that we don't want, no, that's not true. And they're being accused of stealing and doing all kinds of things, which you don't really see with the slaves. So, I don't know how systematic this is, but I think it is, at least, it represents a possibility in this kind of economic activity that is probably more important than we have understood.
Well, thank you so much.